Hi, welcome to a little explainer video about trade and some of the problems with trade. So it's clear that globalization is here to stay. Well, probably. You can see this is just a little data about Ford employees around the world. So what's causing this? Well, there's certainly policy changes. So what's causing this? Well, there's certain policy changes and historical developments, but in general, the force towards more specialization and trade between countries, which is globalization, is a powerful underlying force for the last few hundred years and has meant the huge growth in global production and incomes around the world. But resources are not as free to flow back and forth between borders as goods are. And international financial capital is even the freest of them all. So it's interesting to see how policy is much tighter for immigration control and refugee control than it is for goods and services, and especially financial capital. And in a separate debate, we can look at the sort of the cause of some of our financial crises might just be that super fast flow of financial capital, not matched with the equal flexibility and flow for human resources, for instance, labor across borders, or goods and services. So there's some asymmetry there. So it hasn't always been the case that countries have opened their arms wide to free trade. In fact, some have said that mercantilism is the status quo, the default setting for humans. So what is mercantilism? The idea of zero-sum game, that you cannot gain. One person cannot gain without somebody else losing. In other words, there's a fixed pot, fixed pie, and if my slice is bigger, that must mean your slice is smaller. So the idea of Japan and the US trading back and forth with cars, and if Japan's increased their exports to the US would sort of reflexively think that we were losing. That's that old school mercantilist thought. Economists, by the way, don't share that thought at all. Economists are much more likely to think that that if the trade is voluntary, it must be mutually beneficial. Otherwise, why would you engage in trade? So if Japan is specializing in automobiles and I am buying a Toyota from Japan, it must mean that if I've done it voluntarily, that I'm better off as a result, and Japan is as well. And indeed, if you follow Adam Smith's thinking, specialization allowing my time to not be spent making my own vehicle, but rather in teaching economics or whatever my career is, that's a more efficient use of resources. So specialization and then trading back and forth so that none of us are completely self-sufficient and bad at a lot of things, but rather we specialize in trade so that we're good at one thing, and then we specialize. I buy something from you that you've specialized and you're very good and efficient at. That's the idea of trade. In a separate video, I look at the idea of comparative advantage and how you can calculate that. But in general, the idea is some people will be lower cost, more efficient producers, and those people should be producing that thing. That's how we get globally our limited resources to be the most productive and to meet the most possible human wants and needs. So if mercantilism is the default position, then the policy that follows would be to erect trade barriers and to what has been called beggar thy neighbor policies. So we want to get rich at the expense of everybody else. So let's make policies that benefit our workers, and who cares about the Chinese, the Japanese, the European, the Mexican workers. In a sense, it's a little hypocritical because it puts you in the position of admitting that you like trade, you would like other countries to buy your stuff, but you don't want to lose any jobs. I don't want to lose automobile jobs by trading with Japan, for instance, right? So I like it when everybody else opens their borders and reduces their tariffs and their quotas and other trade barriers against my products. That benefits me. My markets are bigger. So I benefit if everybody else abides by freer trade, but I will not do it myself. So we get stuck in a global situation where all countries might have that position. And that's a real problem, because then we have no free trade. So the solution, which is an interesting one, is to create, along with these regional trade agreements that most areas of the world have, we have a global trade agreement called the World Trade Organization. It used to be called GATT, or the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trades. But it is now, it's the solution to the problem of everybody wanting to hold back and not really jump in with both feet to free trade, especially when you consider that it's in most democratically elected places, the politicians are beholden to voters who don't see the bigger arguments for trade and are more prone to think about saving their own jobs or jobs within their state or their county or whatever. So this GATT, which would become the World Trade Organization, is part of the post-World War II stitching together of countries across the Atlantic and further to sort of prevent another global war from happening. So this idea of embedding each economic interests ever more powerfully, getting countries sort of more and more dependent on each other for trade and interwoven as a way to prevent a global war. The GATT and the WTO would become part of that. So in 1995, the GATT changes into the WTO. And it's pretty effective. You can see that tariffs are brought down from an average of 40% to about 4% now. Tariffs are just taxes on imports. Most favored nation status is an interesting offshoot that there are different levels within the World Trade Organization. The most favored nation, or MFN status, applies to countries that are allowed to be in this sort of inner circle, which allows them to get the best deals on trade. And it also means that if you're an MFN country, if there's another MFN country that negotiates a trade deal, let's say with Bangladesh, and they and Bangladesh agree to lower tariffs with each other by 50%, that negotiation also applies to all the other countries within the MFN status. It's a way to speed up trade negotiations and to reduce trade barriers as fast as possible, which is the intent of the WTO. And it's a solution to the problem of sort of local, each local zone, each country is probably going to face protectionist tendencies. And this overcomes that. It's designed to overcome that. So is trade unequivocally great? We've sort of, in economics, said that the benefits outweigh the costs. That's not to say that the benefits are equally distributed, fairly distributed, or that we can't do a better job of minimizing the costs or helping transition those that are affected by loss of jobs due to free trade and globalization. We could do a much better job helping them adjust, maybe get money to go back to school, to learn a new craft or skill, etc. But in general, trade, we think, brings more benefits than costs. And here are some of the things that it brings. More efficient production, more goods for everybody, higher standards of living. We wonder about the benefits to small nations or lesser developed countries. There can be, it gets complex. But in general, the idea is that as a small country, you can stand to gain a lot